Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are unpacking a seriously fascinating essay that offers a literally forensic analysis of identity. We're diving into a deep structural exploration of what's called the adoptee awakening. And get this, the author examines the whole concept through the lens of a story you probably thought you knew inside and out, Pinocchio. So yeah, this isn't just your standard fairy tale breakdown. It's a profound, eye-opening look into objectification and how a person's very core identity is constructed from the ground up.
You know, when we talk about waking up in our culture, we almost always point straight to the Matrix, right? We completely obsess over this idea of escaping a fake world to finally see reality. But the essay we're looking at today presents a much more devastating frequency. Think about it. While The Matrix is about awakening to a fabricated world, the myth of Pinocchio, it's about awakening to a fabricated self. For an adopted person, the author argues, awakening isn't just about recognizing some systemic illusion out there. It's actually a brutal reckoning with having been constructed, literally conditioned, to fill someone else's existential vacuum.
Okay, let's dive into this. The author uses a five-dimensional analytical framework to dismantle this whole rescue myth. We'll be hitting the architecture of creation, Stromboli's cage, the blue fairy contract, Pleasure Island, and finally, emancipation.
Starting with Dimension 1, the architecture of creation, or the object as a solution to grief. This analysis begins right in Geppetto's workshop, where identity doesn't begin with organic lineage, but with craftsmanship.
So the author methodically maps this creation pipeline directly to the foundational framework of modern adoption. It begins with step 1, a systemic vacuum. This is usually grief, infertility, or maybe an unfulfilled family narrative. That directly leads to step 2, the act of creation, which is legal adoption or emotional crafting. Then comes step 3, and this is heavy. The expectation that this newly acquired object absolutely must heal the creator's wound. And finally, step 4, the implicit contract. The adoptee has to seamlessly fill the exact space carved out by those adult desires. The adoptee doesn't just arrive as a blank, neutral entity. According to the essay, they are brought in as a highly specific utilitarian solution to pre-existing conditions.
The essay presents a really brutal realization of this utility. It states, quote, "You are never the subject of your own origin story. You are the object that resolves someone else's plot." Just let that sink in for a second. The child's complex, messy interiority is completely forced to take a back seat to their primary systemic function. They are literally there to inhabit a mold.
Moving to Dimension 2, Stromboli's cage of performance and the commodity of the good story. Once Pinocchio leaves the workshop, he's targeted because he is a living object. He dances without strings, generating applause and profit for Stromboli.
This leads us to an absolutely crucial concept the author calls performative gratitude. It's basically the dominant cultural mandate requiring adoptees to completely frame their experience as luck, salvation, and just unmitigated rescue. The beautifully rescued child is celebrated publicly, sure, but only for exactly as long as they flawlessly perform the script and validate the system's benevolence.
But you know, what happens when the show is over? In the story, Stromboli locks Pinocchio in a tiny iron birdcage. For the adoptee, the internal iron birdcage holds everything society desperately does not want to see. We're talking grief over maternal separation, anger at identity erasure, and systemic critique. And if any of that leaks out, well, the analysis notes, it is swiftly punished and pathologized as personal dysfunction, maladjustment, or just sheer ingratitude. Clarity is literally treated as a defect. The essay captures this trap so perfectly. It says, "The cage is not a punishment for failure. It was always there. The applause was merely your distraction." It challenges all of us to look at our own participation in this dynamic. I mean, how often does our societal applause just mask the systemic objectification of the person up there on the stage?
All right, Dimension 3, the blue fairy contract and conditional humanity. Now, the author argues this is perhaps the most insidious layer of the entire systemic structure.
Notice how the blue fairy holds absolute institutional power. She can totally grant Pinocchio his ultimate desire to become a real boy, but she absolutely refuses unconditional transformation. Instead, she enforces what the author calls conditional humanity. She imposes this rigid contract. You must prove you are brave, truthful, and unselfish. Only by achieving and maintaining this totally arbitrary moral standard will you be granted baseline humanity. She is basically holding his real boy status completely hostage.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core trauma of adoption. For a natural-born child, they are afforded unconditional belonging,
They are allowed to be flawed, selfish, or lost without their fundamental right to exist in their family being constantly renegotiated. But for the adopted child, belonging is implicitly framed as an earned privilege. They must maintain absolute perfection to remain valid.
Why this matters is absolutely crucial for us to wrap our heads around. When you see an adoptee excelling academically, never causing trouble, and remaining hyper-palatable, society usually pats them on the back and calls this behavior virtue. But the essay reframes this entirely. Actually, scratch that. It doesn't just reframe it, it tears it down. It argues that this isn't virtue at all. It is a survival strategy in a marathon without an end. The test was never about character, guys. It was always about compliance.
Let's shift to Dimension 4, Pleasure Island's dehumanizing trap, and the regression to the beast. So what happens when the burden of performing this conditional humanity just becomes completely unsustainable?
Well, eventually, the performance stops. The adoptee deviates by doing things like expressing grief, setting boundaries, exhibiting depression, or simply refusing to play that grateful role. And when they do this to reclaim a little autonomy outside the sanitized script, society's response is immediate. They are no longer the beautifully rescued child. Suddenly, they are reframed as a damaged product of bad biological lineage.
The essay draws a really stark warning from the myth here. In the Pinocchio story, boys who misbehave on Pleasure Island literally physically transform into donkeys destined for slavery in the salt mines. The metaphor here is wild. If you do not maintain the exact mold carved for you, if you deviate from the sanitized script, you will be reduced to a beast of burden, carrying the heavy weight of your own supposed pathology.
And that brings us to one of the most striking realizations in the entire analysis. The author writes, "The beast was always your potential. The transformation was their perception of you the moment you stopped being useful." Wow. The system's benevolence was always entirely contingent on the adoptee's utility. The second that utility drops, the conditional humanity is immediately revoked.
Finally, Dimension 5, the radical act of emancipation and cutting the strings. Here, the author completely reframes Pinocchio's traditional, tragic ending into a fierce, post-tragic turn toward true liberation.
Think about it. The sanitized fairy tale. Pinocchio only becomes real when he essentially dies saving Geppetto, fulfilling his ultimate utility to the creator. But this emancipated reading demands we reject that false resolution completely. True awakening requires realizing that the blue fairy's scale is permanently rigged. You cannot heal the system that fractured you by trying to be its perfect product. Genuine liberation means rejecting that institutional validation entirely.
So emancipation happens in a brutal but absolutely necessary three-phase trajectory. Phase 1 is acceptance of the wood, basically acknowledging your history was altered and you were shaped by hands other than your own. It's a really heavy realization. Then comes Phase 2, severing the mechanics, making the terrifying choice to drop the performance and just stop dancing for applause. And finally, Phase 3 is self-authentication, boldly declaring your sovereign right to your own messy, uncurated humanity without waiting around for the blue fairy's permission.
So, what does this all mean? The essay asks an incredibly thought-provoking question to pivot us toward the ultimate reward of this painful forensic reckoning. What happens when you finally accept that your creation was contingent, but your existence is not?
The answer is just incredibly empowering. When you stop asking for permission, you become something the myth never even anticipated. You don't just become a real boy by their rigid standards. No way. You become something so much better. You stand entirely on your own terms as an autonomous, self-determined, self-authored human being who has clearly seen the strings and deliberately cut them anyway.
It's an absolute game-changer of a perspective, perfectly summarizing a sustained confrontation with objectification. The author leaves us with this powerful thought. The only way out of the cage is to stop believing the cage is a stage. If you found this breakdown as fascinating as I did, I highly encourage you to question your own frameworks and read the full essay on Substack to explore these concepts even deeper. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning everything.